I was listening to a recording of a talk given by Swami Kriyananda, the founder of Ananda. It was a talk from some years ago. And often principles that I've heard articulated literally for decades. Sometimes something will just suddenly strike me and I'll understand it in a new way. There's always been this question about what part does ego play on the spiritual path. In fact, we have a perennial topic that we recycle every so often, and the subject is ego, friend or foe. And also when we teach energization exercises, which is Yogananda's unique contribution to the science of yoga, teaching us how to use the power of the will through the body to develop mastery over our energy. And we talk about the ego being centered at the medulla and the spiritual self being centered at the spiritual eye. And it's this little distance transferring sense of self from the ego to the sense of the infinite that the whole spiritual path is about. But interestingly, in the teaching of the energization exercises, we talk about how the energy flows in through the medulla, and we teach people to concentrate and to draw that energy through and then gain conscious mastery over it throughout the body. And even though I've taught this now for many, many years, there's always been that slight hesitation in my own mind about why would you want to concentrate on the medulla when this is the point where you want the energy to flow. And so I've dealt with it by just kind of rushing past it and hoping that nobody asks. And it's not that I can't fake a very good answer, but there's a difference between being able to articulate something and really understanding it clearly, so you have the magnetism behind it. Well, in this talk that I was listening to of Swamiji's, that for all I know, I was sitting there when he first gave it, because I hardly ever missed any talk that he ever gave for decades in this country. I didn't always follow him out of the country. But he said that what it is about ego, he was saying that even a master has an ego, even a perfect self-realized master like Jesus, like Yogananda, like Krishna, like Buddha, thinking of Yogananda as an example because he was here and now, has to have a certain amount of ego. There has to be sufficient identification, and Yogananda's definition of ego is the infinite soul identified with the physical body. It never becomes the physical body, it's never defined by the physical body in truth, but the infinite has identified itself with this one body. Now, the degree to which one identifies with this one body defines the degree to which the material world is your reality. But there has to be sufficient identification so you'll know, as Yogananda himself put it, which body to feed, which body to move. And in fact, toward the end of his life, when Paramahansa Yogananda, whom we call Master, his mind was so removed from the particular, and so he was in the last years of his life, and he was able to let go to a greater extent. Swami Kriyananda describes walking along, and Master was sort of leaning on his arm, and then Master sort of stumbled, and he explained to Kriyananda, he said, "I'm in so many bodies, sometimes I forget which one I'm supposed to keep moving." And then he said, "I have to ask others whether or not I've eaten," because there was so little identification that what happened with this one body didn't distinguish itself in the realm of experiences. It was just something that happened. Now, this consciousness is the real secret of what people call non-attachment. When you're non-attached, it's not that you don't care. It's not that you're not deeply engaged and committed. It's just that you haven't identified so exclusively with a narrow reality that everything else is seen in terms of that. You know, if this body is sick, if this body is unhappy, if this body didn't get its desires, if this body is dying, then if you're identified with that, then your whole state of feeling, your feeling reality, also becomes defined by that one reality. If you see yourself as part of a greater universe, then the fact that something is happening to this body you may understand that it's happening, but your awareness encompasses much more. I was very sweetly touched once when a dear friend of mine gave birth to her first child, and she is by nature, and has remained so, has a very expansive consciousness. And Swami Kriyananda and others of us went over to see her and, goo-goo over the baby and all the things that you do. And we sat there for a little while, and we goo-gooed over the baby, and we talked about what was going on. And then in the most gracious manner, she was, hardly a day away from the birth of the baby. She just very graciously turned the conversation to other subjects. And it was a small gesture, but it was indicative of her consciousness. Perhaps one of the most important events of her life had just taken place, but she wasn't still so deeply identified with her unique reality that she couldn't remember. And it wasn't just an act of politeness. It was her actual consciousness. Well, enough about me, I was amused. There's a Steve Martin movie. I can't even remember what the whole context was, but in the comedian Steve Martin, whom I find extremely funny, and he was giving this big speech about how their team was going to be very successful and all these glorious things were going to happen to them and they would be so important. And then just without missing a beat, he says, and when I say we, I mean me. And so often I sort of joke to myself like that. And when I say we, I really mean me, of course, because that's how the consciousness takes it, isn't it? Now, to go back to where I was trying to get with Swamiji's original comment, there has to be a degree of ego. We can't try to transcend that ego by making ourselves not exist, because we have a responsibility to exist. God didn't send us into this world to be nothing. Be fruitful in the gifts which I have given you in the Festival of Light. The little bird, we say at the ritual at the end of our service. Some of you who are new will hear it for the first time today. Others of you have heard it many, many times. The little bird is commissioned by the infinite. He's sent out on this divine journey, and God gives him a command. It's a very simple command. Be fruitful in the gifts I have given you. Expand and multiply them. And what I have given you, share with others, as we have shared with you, as the divine shares with all. So God needs, the infinite needs human instruments. Swamiji once remarked that many beautiful and uplifting things in this world that God wills for the world never express themselves for lack of a willing human instrument. God doesn't act directly. We're not just walking down the street, suddenly a great opera manifests on the sidewalk and starts performing in holographic form or something like that, a new electric car, a new form of solar power, a new computer system. It doesn't just sort of appear and you just go to the heavenly warehouse and pick it up, that the inspiration comes into the mind and consciousness of individuals. And individuals who are attuned always have that feeling that it was simply given to them. It just pops into their head. And inspiration comes in all forms. When Ananda was engaged in this very complicated lawsuit over who owned Yogananda's teachings, and it went on in the 90s, and it was a great adventure, and a very key, in fact, the key legal argument that we came up with was given into the mind of our lawyer. And he's a devoted soul, but he wasn't a disciple. But still, he said he just felt like he was just sitting there, and all of a sudden he felt like the idea was dropped into his head to essentially challenge the legitimacy of certain copyrights. Really, you would think God would think about other things, but a great deal was at stake here. Go to Washington, D.C., the voice said, and check out the copyright department. So we sent someone to the Library of Congress, and lo and behold, the copyrights were false. And the whole lawsuit that we won hinged on that idea coming into his mind. But it had to come into his mind. He had to listen. We had to go to Washington. We had to do all the hard work. We had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in court. It didn't just appear like that. Because the ego also plays this role, which it is the individualized form of spirit, inhabiting this material world, acting with the divine power within it. But the key is, as Swami put it, you have to make sure that the ego doesn't block the divine flow. Isn't that simple? You have to make sure that the ego doesn't block the flow. And if we're identified sufficiently with the unique responsibility that we've been given, with whatever name and karmic pattern that we carry, all of us walks around in these remarkable bodies that each one looks different from one another. Have you ever wondered why we don't look all the same? 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth. How remarkable it is. Even from little babyhood. There they are. They're all so different. A mother can find her own baby. A mother penguin can find her own baby penguin. I'm sure all of you have seen that film, or most of you, The March of the Penguins, which is that incredible journey to Antarctica or to the Arctic Circle. I don't know which one it was. Anyway, it was really cold. And there was a whole lot of penguins who, as far as I'm concerned, you could line up 12 of them and it would be pretty hard to tell which was which. And they're all bunched together, and they're all these little screaming baby penguins. And I think it was the most remarkable part of the whole thing. The parents can hear in that complete cacophony of squealing penguins, they know just which penguin is theirs. They believe they do because they can understand, they can recognize the voice of their own baby penguin. Now, an interesting factor, which yoga science asserts, which is true, is that the voice is really the instrument of consciousness. And one of the things that happens when you practice yoga is the voice becomes sweeter. And not just the singing voice, but the speaking voice. And you can also work that in reverse. You can strongly influence your consciousness by taking control over your own voice. Which chakra is it coming from? What kind of consciousness does it express? When I was earlier in my married life and trying to gain mastery over the remarkable capacity of a woman to become emotional over nothing, I began to realize in my relationship to my husband that it really didn't matter the content. As soon as I heard a certain tone in my voice which sounded like this, then as soon as I heard that, whatever I was saying was wrong. It really didn't matter how factual it was. I knew it was wrong because my voice was beginning to manifest what I called the panic survival response, which could be based on something as small as where we were going out to dinner, but it was just like all of a sudden there was this tremendous sense of threat and the need to attack, all the things that happen. I'm not proud of it, but there it is. But it was all in the sound of the voice, because the voice is consciousness. Swami Kriyananda has such a distinctive voice. He can call someone in any country. He laughs about it. He'll just call up and he'll hardly breathe into the phone, just the little bit of a sound. And they'll say, whoever's on the other end will say, Swamiji, just like that, because the vibration is so distinct. I was very attuned to a dear friend of mine for many years, the first dozen years almost that I lived in Ananda. We were inseparable girlfriends. I could tell by the sound of her cough what kind of a mood she was in. Because if she had a certain consciousness, everything that came out of her sounded like that. She had a tendency to be moody in that time, and she would cough, and I would say, oh dear, she's feeling down today. Just like that. But it had the sound in it. Because that's what we are. Everything that comes through us is through this filter. And it's not that the individuality and the unique expression is a difficulty. That's not the problem. The problem is when we squeeze down that individuality and by our relationship to it, we squeeze the infinite into a smaller box than it should be. Make the infinite serve us instead of us trying to serve the infinite. Now, this is what the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita are talking about when they talk about the inner kingdom. Where does our consciousness come from? Where does our reality come from? Who are we serving and what are we going to be in this world? Too often, in a misunderstanding in the past, the idea of overcoming the ego was that we had to suppress that individuality. We had to be pious in a certain sort of paper cutout of what that piety was. Swamiji describes going one time to go visit a monastery, I think somewhere in Europe, and there was a nun showing him around, and it was a place where there were sacred relics. I think he went, or maybe he was just visiting, who knows. He says this very pious nun was showing him around, and here's our chapel, and here is where we worship the baby, the blessed Jesus, like that. And he was just going along with her, and then another nun came, and she had a box of candy. And the nun said, ooh, chocolates! Just like that. And he said he felt she was far more spiritually inspired over when she spoke about the chocolates. And it wasn't really that she loved the chocolates more than she loved the blessed Jesus. It was that she didn't allow her ego to block. She was just allowing the Divine Spirit to flow through her in whatever way it felt like flowing, instead of flowing through in the way that the ego had decided she had to allow it. Now, don't misunderstand me. We can't really just give free rein to anything that occurs to us. A little bit of discrimination is in order here. But it has to be the right kind of discrimination. It has to be a discrimination based on the inward practice of discovering who and what we really are and what we're really intended to be. And there's no way to find that out except by removing our attention from time to time on this everly outwardly defined reality and sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into that source. That's the profound and magnificent reason why Yogananda created the energization exercises. Let us practice by a conscious act of will, deliberately and intently, feeling this energy flow. Let us understand that we swim in an ocean of energy, and by the conscious exercise of our free choice, we draw that energy through and we direct that energy wherever we want to send it. I am campaigning for learning and doing the energization exercises shamelessly and determinedly. You have no idea what a magnificent set of practices they are. They seem a little confusing even conceivably at first, but what you learn from them is you learn I am limitless. I am a bubble in the great ocean of energy, and I can shift my attention in whatever direction I choose and have the power of the infinite go through me. And deliberately sending that energy through the medulla trains us to not allow the mere presence of a physical body, the mere presence of all of that has gone with it in the past and in the present and in the future, to in any way inhibit that flow. When Yogananda was living, he acted on behalf of the divine without any limitation to his energy. He did only, as he put it himself, what Divine Mother asked him to do. When Swami Kriyananda, as a young man of 22, was kneeling before him to be initiated as a disciple, Yogananda asked of his disciple, he said, "Will you give me your unconditional obedience?" And Swami Kriyananda describes his own state of mind. There he was. He just met Yogananda. This initiation took place within the first half an hour of their first meeting, and he'd only read Autobiography of a Yogi less than a week earlier. And now the power of this master is focused on him. They're alone in a room together. And this man says to him, this godlike figure says to him, "Will you give me your unconditional obedience?" And Swamiji describes, he said he was desperate to be accepted. He'd reached the point in his own life where the only thing he wanted was spiritual life, and he was certain that Yogananda was his guru. It had just come to him with an overwhelming power. But he said he had to be sincere. So he had the courage to say right into Yogananda's eyes, "What if I think you're wrong?" And Master replied to him, "I will never ask anything of you that God doesn't tell me to ask." And Swamiji said, "Then I give you my unconditional obedience." Of course, that was based on what was already in him, with the faith that this man, this guru, knew God, and therefore if he said, "I am acting with the divine will, and only as an instrument of that will," then Swami Kriyananda accepted. Very extraordinary moments to just meditate upon. But Paramhansa Yogananda had done the sadhana in many, many incarnations by the time he was born in that particular form. As he described it, he said, when you're floating in the infinite, and I mean, what does this really mean? But this is how he describes it, and it's time for you to incarnate and live out this lifetime again. He said, and you see, he's talking about, descending into matter. You see the body and the personality you have to assume. There you are, infinite consciousness, then you have to become Paramhansa Yogananda. Like this, one entity, one form, one nationality, one set of eyes, like this. He said, at first it feels very confining, like a heavy overcoat on a hot day. He said, kind of itchy and uncomfortable. Now imagine having the inner freedom to feel that your body is kind of itchy and uncomfortable, that your personality and your nationality is just squeezing you down like that. But then he said, but after a while you get used to it. You figure out where you're supposed to be. And Yogananda describes previous incarnations, different lives that he lived. He was Arjuna in the time of Krishna. He was William the Conqueror at that historical point in history. He said he was a Spanish king at a certain point that played a critical role in driving the Moors out of Spain and maintaining it in devotion to Christ. I mean, you don't even know where to go with that, and I won't go there right now. There's a very, very good book called Two Souls, Four Lives. It's coming out in a couple of months, and it's about that life of William the Conqueror and Swami Kriyananda's role with him. But the end of all of that is, this is something that we assume, and the greater degree of freedom that we can have, that's how to live happily in this world. I was starting to say with Yogananda, but he never held back. Once he was given that responsibility, which is really what it is, that's the most fun way to think about yourself. Swami Kriyananda put it that way. I never identify with Swami Kriyananda, he said, meaning I never allow myself and my reality to be defined. He said, but I consider it an event for which I am responsible. If you're putting on a party, you have to be very responsible. A couple of weeks ago, we had this beautiful tea out on the lawn in our community. And I was responsible for a great many aspects of that. We had to cook, we had to put the food on the table, and believe me, we did not hold back. You can't make food for 70 people if you hold back. There won't be anything on the tables. We were just full out for 3 days making that happen, and we didn't stop till the last cup was washed. But I never actually thought that I was the tea party. I didn't sort of see myself as lace tablecloths and china cups. And when one of the cups broke, it didn't really hurt me. There was nothing that happened, and something burned, or when I tried to cook the last batch of scones in an oven that I had turned off, and the scones just kept sort of growing in this peculiar way, but never really turning into anything, and I was just so bewildered. It was the very last thing that happened. I kept opening it, and they were spreading, and it was really like the blob taking over the oven, and only much later did it occur to me that the oven was cool. Maybe that was the problem. But I never felt like I myself was oozing out over the cookie sheets, because it was just an event for which I am responsible. But of course, if our career has a little problem, it's a little hard for us to see it that way, isn't it? And when our bodies begin to age, or we break a leg, or somebody we relied upon turns against us, it's a little bit hard to be as impersonal as we are about scones just blobbing out in the oven, isn't it? But it's just an event for which we are responsible, and I had to deal with those scones, and so I threw them away. It was a very clever thing, just hide the evidence, seemed like a really good idea to me. But it was more like, let's not mourn this anymore, let's just go forward. That's what we do if it's just something that we have to make happen. Isn't that true? We get very practical, this needs to be done, we assess the situation, and then we do what has to happen. Because it's a responsibility. It's not a self-definition. Now, the great art of life is to be so engaged for so long and so much with complete commitment, and yet inwardly always to be free. Swami Kriyananda asked Master, he said, are you always conscious of your infinite self? And Master, he said, how can you live in this world, in essence? And Yogananda said, well, one accepts the role that one has been given, but inwardly you are always free. It's the freedom of the heart. That's what defines it. It's not freedom from challenging karma, no such luck. The Master's lives sometimes are fraught with more difficulties than we can even imagine. Example, Jesus, he didn't exactly have an easy ride, and his life was cut off rather early in a most dramatic and what we can only call extremely unpleasant way. So merely giving our lives to God does not say, oh, well, from now on, no problem, honey. But it gives us another reality that we can live from. That's why the Gita says, even a little practice of this inward religion will free one from dire fears and colossal sufferings. It does not mean that your karma will be different or your responsibility will be different. It's not necessarily a bad thing to be given great, challenging responsibilities. If you go to work in a company and they give you enormous, challenging responsibilities, don't you consider that, first of all, much less boring than just running the Xerox machine? And you also consider it like a great tribute to your capacities, don't you? Look at all the responsibility I've been given. So when God gives us great responsibilities and asks us to undertake enormously challenging events, why would we say, oh, please, no, 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 give me the Xerox machine? You know, but that's exactly how we should respond, because this is an event for which we are responsible. And even if we're working and we have a lot of responsibilities, you know, we never make ourselves what we're doing. There's always a part of us that has another life. And so we live, as Master said, like the servant in the home of a rich employer. We must take care of that home as if it belonged to us, but the servant always knows that its true home is back in the village. And so it is with us. Our true home, it's the infinite spirit. Our true home is the astral world from which we come, the causal world to which we go, our relationship with the infinite. And we carry out this responsibility with dynamic will and enthusiasm, but with perfect inner freedom, because we also know where we really belong.